You're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. Our guest today is David Daley, an activist and author of the book Ratf, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. David Daley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
The subtitle of your book is Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Why doesn't my vote count?
Well, that's a really good place to start. What gerrymandering does is it creates districts that are completely non-competitive, and they are designed to elect members of one party or another party. And whenever you have a non-competitive election, it simply means that your vote is diluted. It doesn't actually have any impact. The lines are drawn in state legislative races and in congressional races in order to produce a certain outcome. Usually that outcome is that a member of a specific political party is wired to win that race. If you are someone who is not a member of that political party, your vote simply doesn't count. If you are a member who is in that party, it's essentially wired for the incumbent to hold on to it for as long as they want, unless if there's a challenger from the extreme part of the base. So, essentially, we have created all of these elections. I mean, John Adams talked about, state legislatures and Congress as being a portrait of the people in miniature. And yet, I am almost 50 years old, and I have lived in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Kentucky, and North Carolina. I have never in my life voted in a competitive state legislative or congressional race. I've always walked in and pulled that lever knowing who was going to win the race. And that, I think, is a sorry state of American democracy.
Well, gerrymandering goes back to the early days of the Republic. Eldridge Gerry, I don't know exactly. Is that correct?
Eldridge Gerry.
Gerry.
Actually.
Oh, it wasn't
very
Gerry.
Strange.
Should we call it gerrymandering?
We call it gerrymandering, but the man was Eldridge Gerry.
So this was a long time ago, but it's gotten, how bad has it gotten?
Oh, boy.
Can you quantify that?
Yeah, we've had gerrymandering for as long as we've had politicians. You can trace it back even before Eldridge Gerry. Patrick Henry, in many ways, does the first gerrymander. He screws James Madison out of a seat, or he tries to, in the very first Congress. We should call it Henrymandering. Eldridge Gerry in 1812 his party draws these state senate districts around Boston in such a fanciful shape that a political cartoonist thinks that they look like a salamander, and the word gerrymander is born. And Eldridge Gerry, by all means, a lovely man, a former vice president of the United States, goes down in political infamy. Today's gerrymanders are not Eldridge Gerry's gerrymanders. They are not even the gerrymanders that happened in 1990 or in 2000, which is still in the modern era, but it was before the time of sophisticated GIS mapping software. It was before the time of these incredibly voluminous data sets that just give you such specific information on voters, and the speed and the power of modern computing that allows you to very quickly and very surgically draw districts and know within moments what the likely outcome of those lines mean. We have had a problem with gerrymandering for as long as the country has been around, as long as we've had politicians. Politicians have tried to seek every single advantage, but it's the data and it's the technology that makes today's partisan gerrymanders so much more dangerous, so much more pernicious, and just so much more longer lasting.
So give us some horror stories about what's going on.
Oh, wow. There are 59 million Americans who live in a state where the state legislature, one or both chambers, is controlled by a party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election statewide. So if you live in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin, Michigan, at least one chamber of your legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes. That to me seems extraordinarily dangerous. In Wisconsin, for example, voters elected a Democratic governor, Democratic U.S. senator. They elected Democrats up and down the ballot statewide to Secretary of State, Treasurer, Attorney General, and they gave Democratic Assembly candidates 200,000 plus more votes than Republicans. They picked up one seat. Republicans hold a 63-36 advantage in that chamber. It's not representative of the will of the people. And it's not to say that this is a partisan thing one way or the other. Democrats have done some amazing gerrymanders over the years. It is to say that the gerrymanders that Republicans did in 2010, they had more opportunity to do this. Their timing matched with the explosion of the sophistication of the software that makes this possible. And they did a very impressive job in every single state where they had this opportunity. There is not a state in the nation right now where Republicans get more votes and Democrats are in charge. But the other way, there's an awful lot of it.
Mm. Talk about the recent Supreme Court ruling that we had on partisan gerrymandering. What did that do?
Could I just cry through this entire section?
We have a towel.
Essentially what that did, the Supreme Court has had two different sets of case law on gerrymandering, on partisan gerrymandering and on racial gerrymandering. And racial gerrymandering has very clearly been unconstitutional. Partisan gerrymandering, they have said it's unseemly, but they hadn't been willing to sort of define it when they see it, to, quote Potter Stewart from a very different Supreme Court case. And over the years, there had been lots of standards that litigation had brought before the court. And the court had been reluctant to get involved in disputes over map making because it's just so inherently political, and whatever decision they made would very clearly help or diminish one side or the other. So they have tried to keep a real hands-off on this over the years. The last time that this got before the court was also in a case from Pennsylvania. This was the Veith case from 2004, and the court was deeply divided on this. It ended up being a 5-4 decision that did not go in favor of the plaintiffs who were looking for new maps. But there were three different decisions coming out of this. You had Anton Scalia writing a majority opinion who was ready to slam the door on claims of partisan gerrymandering. He did not want the courts involved. You had the four liberal justices who thought that there was a way forward, and you had Justice Kennedy, forever the Hamlet of the court, kind of in the middle on this, saying, I think that there could be a way forward. I don't see it here. I'm not ready to close the door on this entirely. And so for 10 years, you see all of these cases in which justices were trying to appeal to Justice Kennedy to show him the clear and manageable standard that his court and lower courts could use to enforce in a fair way that would make it clear that the court was not acting to put their thumb on the scale to favor one political party or the other. And in 2017, a couple of cases get before the Supreme Court, and Justice Kennedy does not believe that they have standing issues. So the court kind of kicks those down, back to the lower courts, and then he retires. And so there's all of these cases in the pipeline. There's, those two cases, and then there's the case from North Carolina that was heard in 2018, and suddenly the court completely shifts. Kennedy is no longer the swing justice. You have Brett Kavanaugh on the court. Chief Justice Roberts becomes the key person to convince, and He's never been convincible on the question of partisan gerrymandering. He has never wanted to involve
What's his argument?
Federal courts in this. The argument essentially is that the average man on the street will think that the court is making a political decision to favor a political party. And he looked at these kind of academic social science, metrics that litigants were bringing before him, and he called them sociological gobbledygook. And he said that if you ask people about this, they will say, it doesn't have anything to do with this metric. It's because the justices are favoring Republicans or Democrats. And he was not interested in having the federal courts be involved in this. And essentially what the court did was they slammed the door on all future claims, and they called it non-justiciable.
Is this a consistent position, or are there other ways in which the court does favor one party or another, or makes political decisions?
Yeah, I think that...
or that the conservative justices have supported that?
Well, I would say that the court is making political decisions that favor one party or another all the time. It seems to me that they're, very comfortable having their thumb on the scale, whether that is Citizens United or whether it was the Janus decision on labor unions. Quite often the Supreme Court is, Bush versus Gore. Mm-hmm. They are making decisions that are deeply political and that are going to be seen as political. But in this case, the Chief Justice was not willing to use the power of the federal courts to intervene on behalf of fairness in American elections.
Do you think it's that the conservative justices are utilizing a consistent theory of the Constitution that just happens to have anti-democratic consequences, or are they shifting their interpretations in order to achieve particular goals?
I would say this. I would say that these justices have been consistent on their unwillingness to get involved in partisan gerrymandering questions. But I do think that it is a fair question to ask who benefits from this decision and who appointed these justices. And, the Chief Justice in this decision over the summer, he praised independent commissions, and he said citizens are helping solve this problem, and he sort of pointed to, Michigan and some of the states that have passed independent redistricting commissions. But if you go back just a few years to 2015, when the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission and the constitutionality of that came before the court, the Chief Justice was in the minority of a 5-4 decision that just narrowly upheld the constitutionality of the Arizona Commission. And it's one of his most scathing dissents ever. He blisters the idea of independent commissions. Says that when the Constitution says that the legislature has the power to draw these lines, it means legislature. It does not mean that the people can take that power through initiative and give it to somebody other than the legislature. So
if the legislature appointed a commission, then he would be okay with it, but not through a ballot initiative.
I think that's right. I think conceivably some of these commissions in Utah or in other places he might be fine with. But it makes you wonder. If, for example, a case comes before this court on the Michigan Commission or on the California Commission, would he vote to overturn them? And would he now have the 5 votes on this court to undo it? I think that there's a very real question about whether or not he's being disingenuous in this. And on the plus side, what he said was that, state constitutions do have the power to get involved here. And there are 26 states around the country that have a free, fair, and open election clause in their constitution that provides a robust defense of voting rights. And
there's less gerrymandering in those states typically?
Well, there is at least a mechanism in those states for people to file litigation and protest it. And that's what happened here in Pennsylvania, where you got a new congressional map after Republicans drew a map that gave them 13 of 18 seats, 72% of the of the districts, even in years in which they won fewer than 50% of the vote. And a court stepped in and forced a redraw because it was in violation of that clause in the state constitution. And now you have a 9-9 delegation here, which, that comes pretty close to probably matching what the actual, partisan breakdown of the state is. That's also what was used in North Carolina when the state legislative map was struck down back in September. So
the political tools that we have as citizens are ballot initiatives for independent commissions and state constitutional amendments. Was that what you would say? Is there anything else?
You've got the prospect of congressional litigation. You have the prospect of congressional legislation that would establish, some kind of a different way of doing this, some kind of a national independent commission, or changing the way that we elect members of Congress.
Would the court not say that violates the Constitution?
Congress very clearly in the Constitution has the ability to make its own electoral rules. So I don't think that the court would be able to step in.
This is not a state
case.
A state prerogative.
It's not. I mean, Congress can draw up these rules pretty clearly. But the problem here is that we are running out of states that can do initiatives, and you've only got 26 of 50 states that really have a constitutional route at the state level. So it creates this possibility of what do you do in the other states? And what I fear is that we are creating almost these democracy deserts, and you're going to have some states where there is fairness and reasonable maps, and other states where parties maximize their seat gain as aggressively as they possibly can, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, and there's zero recourse.
Is there some kind of technocratic way to draw a fair map, or is it always just going to be the outcome of political push and pull?
Yeah, I think there is. And I mean, I don't think anybody ought to turn this over to the Jerrytron 2000. I'm here with your map. So it's not necessarily a question of turning this over to a computer, but computers are really, really good at drawing simulated maps and showing you whether or not the ones that the politicians come up with, are they fair or not. And that's been one of the amazing developments in the litigation over the last decade. So like in North Carolina, for example, the case that was at the Supreme Court, all of the lower courts were really impressed. This was the case in Michigan, Ohio, Maryland, Wisconsin as well. You draw these simulated maps that use all the legal criteria, and you do tens of thousands of maps that are, possible plans, and then you compare the partisan breakdown of these, random neutral maps to the ones that the legislature enacted. And what you see was here in Pennsylvania, the map was more biased than 3 billion other maps that a mathematician was able to do on computers. In North Carolina, the legislative map was more biased than 99.7% of the random
Is this
maps.
the kind of data that the Supreme Court, that John Roberts rejected?
He did.
Okay.
He thought that this was too confusing. I think that people can recognize what an outlier is, and if something is in the 0.3 or is in the 1 in 3 billion territory, that seems like people could probably get that. And that's what's so tragic about the decision that the court made, was that there were all of these lower courts, based on maps in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Maryland, North Carolina, that were beginning to develop a standard. And they were saying, this is clear, this is manageable, this is our job to do this, we know how to weigh evidence. There's this combination of looking for evidence about intent and emails and draft maps that kind of show you how a map progresses, and then we can use these tests. And these were bipartisan judges appointed by presidents of both parties who sort of unanimously came to a decision, and the Supreme Court was not willing to go there for whatever reason. There was a real opportunity here for the court to step up and solve this problem, and instead what they've created, I fear, is what will be in 2021 just an unfettered festival of partisan gerrymandering without any fear that anyone's going to step in and do anything about it.
Well, that's uplifting. Former President Obama recently announced an initiative to combat gerrymandering. Could you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I think the Democrats realized that they fell asleep at the switch in 2010. We're in this position right now because Republicans ran a really brilliant electoral play in 2010. So Obama wins in 2008, and Democrats take a supermajority in the U.S. Senate and take the House. And Republicans look around and they go, wait a second, the country's changing, the demographics are changing, what are we going to do? And they realized that 2010 was coming up, and it was a census year, and that if they could win state legislatures back, in what would probably be a good Republican year, because it was a good Democratic year in 2008, and the midterm is often good for the party that's on the outs. And they said, let's focus and run a strategy, based on trying to win state legislatures in all of these states. And they called it Red Map, and it was brilliant. And for $30 million, they won, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina, all these states we keep talking about, Florida, Indiana, Wisconsin. And they were able to draw these lines. And this happened on Obama's watch. And so all of these state legislatures and also Congress in 2012, it's a Democratic year, but nothing budges. And I think Obama sort of realized, we sort of dropped the ball on redistricting. So at the end of his second term, he and Eric Holder decided that one of their top priorities would become working on redistricting and trying to get Democrats back to having a seat at the table again.
What are they doing?
In 2020. They have been encouraging litigation, funding litigation. They have been working on trying to flip back legislative chambers so that Democrats have a seat at the table. They've been doing a lot of awareness building, a lot of organizing and fundraising and activism, trying to get people to understand the importance of the issue. I think that there's a big chunk of the Democratic base that probably kind of needs to understand that if you are looking for action on issues, whether it's guns or healthcare, or kind of any of the things that people within the Democratic Party would like to see happen, that none of that happens until you fix the kind of structural problems, and that gerrymandering might not be the issue you care most about, but it is probably has to be solved before we can take on those issues.
It's interesting you say guns, because guns are something where even a majority of Republicans are in favor of the basic reforms that aren't happening. And it's the same for gerrymandering, right? A majority of Republicans are against partisan gerrymandering just on basic unfairness.
You're right.
But that isn't making things budge. So
it doesn't make things budge because there's powerful incentives for incumbent Republicans to hang on to these districts. I mean, they made a calculus after the Obama election, right? I mean,
so are we just doomed? That's my question, really.
I hope that's not the case. I mean, I think that Americans believe deeply in fair elections, and if you look at what happened in 2018, Ohio, Michigan, Colorado, Utah and Missouri all pass independent redistricting initiatives. These are not, deep blue states. These are purple, even red states. And with the exception of Utah, where it was super close, all of the other ones passed with, 60, even up in the 70%. So Republicans, Democrats, Independents, we can agree on the fact that gerrymandering is bad and that we want fair elections. It's the leadership of political parties that have been hanging on to this. I mean, something has to convince the leadership of the Republican Party that they have to move on from trying to curate voters and double down on a disappearing base. And until that happens, we might be doomed. But it seems like that has to happen relatively soon, whether that be, it takes the form of a thumping in 2020 that makes the party kind of reimagine where they are, or what it is. I don't know what it is, but there are certainly big majorities of Americans that want to see change on this.
Well, with that, thank you so much, David Daley, and I want to also apologize to the estate of Eldridge Gerry for mispronouncing both of his names.
I don't think he minds.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure.